You really chose this? Ryan asked, looking at the little house as if it were the saddest joke he had heard all week. The words were light. His smile was not. Amara Bennett stood beside the weathered wooden gate of the tiny cottage, one hand resting quietly on the latch. Morning sunlight spilled across the gravel path, catching the edges of her simple cream sweater and the gold hoops at her ears. Behind her, a kettle whistled softly through an open window. Ryan glanced around. One bedroom. Faded porch steps. A narrow garden with rosemary growing beside the fence. An old blue mailbox leaning slightly to one side. Then he laughed. So this is where you ended up after everything? Amara looked at him. For a moment, she remembered the last time they had stood this close. Back then, Ryan had been wearing a wedding ring. She had still believed that love meant staying when things became difficult. Now his left hand was bare. Hers was too. She lowered her eyes to the small brass key between her fingers. It's enough, she said. Ryan gave a short laugh. Enough? He looked toward the cottage again, almost relieved by what he saw. During their marriage, he had always complained that Amara never wanted expensive things. She never demanded designer clothes. She never cared about luxury cars or rooftop restaurants. When they traveled, she remembered the names of waiters and hotel staff instead of taking pictures of the suites. Ryan had mistaken all of that for lack of ambition. After the divorce, he had expected her to struggle. And now, standing in front of this tiny cottage, he thought his prediction had finally come true. I guess life didn't exactly work out the way you planned, he said. Amara felt something tighten beneath her ribs. Not anger. Something older. The quiet ache of remembering how many times she had been told she was not enough. She could have explained. She could have told him that the cottage had been her choice. That she had chosen the small kitchen because she loved the morning light through its eastern window. That she liked hearing rain against the tin roof. That she could walk barefoot through the garden before coffee. Instead, she simply smiled. You look happy, Ryan said, almost surprised. I am. That answer seemed to bother him more than anything else. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You know, Amara, you don't have to pretend with me. She looked past him toward the quiet road. I'm not pretending. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then a faint mechanical sound came from somewhere beyond the trees. Amara's eyes moved toward the rear of the property. Ryan noticed the movement. What's back there? Nothing you need to worry about. He smiled again, but this time there was curiosity beneath it. Amara opened the cottage door. Before stepping inside, she glanced once toward the distant line of trees. Hidden behind them stood a tall iron gate, almost completely covered by ivy. Ryan couldn't see what lay beyond it. He only saw an ordinary little cottage. And that was exactly how Amara wanted it. As the door closed quietly behind her, Ryan remained on the gravel path, still wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had understood the entire story. He hadn't. Not even close. Ryan had always believed that the easiest way to understand a person was to look at what they owned. He never realized that, sometimes, the things a person refused to show could tell a far deeper story. 3 years earlier, Amara Bennett had stood in the same kitchen where Ryan once promised they would grow old together. The morning light had fallen across 2 untouched cups of coffee. Her wedding ring had felt strangely heavy on her finger. Ryan had been standing near the window, staring at his reflection instead of looking at her. You're not the same anymore, he had said. Amara remembered the words because of how quietly he spoke them. Not angrily. Not cruelly. Almost as if he were discussing the weather. She had looked down at her hands. She had spent years making their home comfortable. She remembered Ryan's favorite coffee. She remembered the meetings he hated, the birthdays he forgot, the shirts that needed to be dry cleaned before important dinners. She had never thought of those things as sacrifices. She had thought of them as love. But Ryan had begun to see them differently. He wanted a larger house. A better neighborhood. A more impressive circle of friends. He wanted photographs that looked expensive. Amara wanted mornings without pretending. That difference had grown quietly between them until one evening, Ryan finally said what he had been thinking for months. "I need a life that feels bigger." Amara had stared at him for several seconds. Then she asked, "And you think I'm what's making it small?" Ryan never answered directly. He didn't have to. The silence did it for him. Weeks later, the divorce papers were signed. Ryan walked away believing he had escaped a woman without ambition. Amara walked away carrying a small box of personal belongings and the strange sensation of having forgotten how to breathe. For the first few months, she moved carefully through each day. She rented a modest apartment. She learned how to eat dinner alone. She learned that silence could hurt before it became peaceful. There were mornings when she woke before sunrise and instinctively reached toward the empty side of the bed. Her hand always stopped halfway. Then, slowly, something changed. She stopped waiting for Ryan to understand her. She stopped explaining herself. And she began building a life that belonged entirely to her. That was when the cottage appeared. Small. Quiet. Hidden behind trees. It had none of the things Ryan once considered important. No marble entrance. No polished driveway. No impressive view from the street. But when Amara first stepped inside, sunlight poured through the eastern window and settled across the wooden floor. She smiled. For the first time in years, she wasn't choosing a home to impress anyone. She was choosing it for herself. What Ryan never knew was that Amara's simplicity had never meant weakness. Long before their marriage ended, there had been another life waiting quietly behind her name. A life connected to her family. To old properties. To investments. To decisions that had been protected from public attention for years. Amara had never spoken about it with Ryan. Not because she was ashamed. Because she had wanted, just once, to know what it felt like to be loved without the weight of money standing between two people. Now, sitting alone in her little cottage, she watched the morning light move across the table. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. A message from her family trustee. "The documents are ready." Amara read it once. Then she locked the phone. Outside, beyond the cottage garden, something metallic moved quietly among the trees. A gate. A world Ryan had never known existed. And a secret Amara was finally ready to stop running from. Ryan drove away from the cottage believing he had just witnessed the final chapter of Amara Bennett's life. He was wrong. What he had actually seen was the first page of a story he had never been invited to read. For the next several weeks, Ryan occasionally checked her social media. Not because he missed her. At least, that was what he told himself. He simply wanted to know how she was doing. The photographs were almost painfully ordinary. Amara standing beside a small table outside the cottage with a cup of coffee in her hand. Amara carrying a basket of groceries through the garden. Amara kneeling beside a row of herbs, her sleeves rolled up as sunlight warmed the side of her face. There were no luxury restaurants. No expensive vacations. No new car. No glamorous parties. Nothing Ryan could use as evidence that she had somehow risen above the life he had left behind. He smiled at one photograph. "She really did start over," he murmured. His fiancée, sitting across the room, barely looked up from her phone. "Is that your ex?" Yeah. She seems happy. Ryan shrugged. She always liked simple things. The words sounded harmless. But there was something dismissive underneath them. He still remembered Amara that way. Simple. Quiet. Predictable. The woman who had never complained when he came home late. The woman who had stood beside him when his career was still uncertain. The woman who had believed in him before anyone else did. Somewhere along the way, Ryan had stopped seeing those qualities as devotion. He had started seeing them as weakness. Meanwhile, Amara was learning how to live without explaining herself. Every morning, she opened the cottage windows and let the cool air move through the rooms. She watered the rosemary. She made coffee. She worked at the small wooden desk near the eastern window. And every afternoon, a black sedan quietly entered the private road behind the trees. It never stopped in front of the cottage. It never appeared in her photographs. The driver would leave an envelope on the back porch before disappearing through the trees again. One Thursday morning, Amara opened one. Inside was a thick folder marked with a familiar family seal. Her fingers paused against the embossed emblem. For years, she had tried to keep that part of her life distant. Her father's estate. The properties. The investment accounts. The foundation. The responsibilities that had quietly waited for her while she tried to become someone outside her family's shadow. But now the time had come to face them. Her phone rang. Ms. Bennett, an older man's voice said gently, "The trustees are asking whether you are ready." Amara looked through the window. Beyond the garden, the trees moved softly in the morning wind. "I am," she said. There was a brief silence. "And the gate?" Amara glanced toward the hidden road. "Keep it closed." Across town, Ryan was telling a friend about her. "She's living in this tiny cottage now," he said with a faint laugh. "Honestly, I think she's finally accepted that some people are meant for smaller lives." The people around him laughed politely. Ryan smiled. He had no idea that, only a few miles away, Amara was signing documents connected to properties he had never heard of. He had no idea that the little cottage he mocked stood on land that had belonged to her family for generations. And he certainly had no idea that the locked gate behind the trees was about to open. Not for him. Not yet. But soon, Ryan would have a reason to walk through it. And when that day came, the woman he thought he had defeated would no longer be standing behind the gate. She would be waiting on the other side. The gate opened at 6:17 in the morning, but Amara Bennett did not step through it immediately. She stood on the narrow wooden porch of her little cottage, holding a cup of coffee between both hands, watching the first pale light settle over the garden. Dew clung to the rosemary leaves. Somewhere beyond the trees, a bird called once, then disappeared into the quiet. From the road, nothing about the property looked unusual. That was the point. Amara took one slow breath and walked toward the back of the cottage. There, hidden behind a wall of ivy and old magnolia branches, stood the gate Ryan had never noticed. It was taller than she remembered. Black iron. Heavy. Its surface carried the faint outline of the Bennett family crest, almost invisible beneath years of weather and climbing vines. A man in a dark suit waited on the other side. "Good morning, Ms. Bennett." Amara nodded. "Good morning, Mr. Harris." He opened the gate. The sound was soft, but it seemed to change the entire morning. Beyond it, a private road curved through acres of green land. The cottage disappeared behind the trees within seconds. Amara walked slowly. The gravel beneath her shoes gave a quiet crunch with every step. She had spent months keeping this world separate from the life she had chosen. Now the separation was beginning to disappear. At the end of the road, the trees opened. And there it was. The estate. Not a mansion designed to impress strangers, but an old stone residence surrounded by gardens that stretched farther than the eye could immediately follow. Tall windows caught the morning sun. Ivy climbed the southern walls. A long reflecting pool ran beside a row of white roses. Several workers were already moving through the grounds. One gardener lifted his cap when he saw her. "Morning, Miss Bennett." Amara smiled. "Morning, James." Another employee approached with a folder. "The trustees are waiting inside." Amara took the folder. For a moment, her fingers rested against the family seal. She remembered her father. She remembered how, when she was younger, he had told her that wealth was not something to display. "It's a responsibility," he had said. At the time, she hadn't understood. After her marriage to Ryan, she understood too well. Money had changed the way people looked at him. It had changed the way he looked at her. So she had hidden it. Not because she was ashamed. Because she wanted to discover who she was when nobody could measure her by what stood behind her name. Inside the estate, the atmosphere was different from the cottage. Quiet footsteps crossed polished floors. Sunlight poured through enormous windows. Portraits of generations of the Bennett family watched from the walls. Amara stopped before one of them. Her father stood in the center, younger than she remembered, wearing the same calm expression he had carried throughout her childhood. She touched the edge of the frame. "I'm ready now," she whispered. Mr. Harris waited several feet away. "You don't have to do this today." Amara turned. "Yes, I do." She walked into the meeting room. Documents waited across a long oak table. Property deeds. Foundation records. Investment reports. Names of companies she had heard about all her life but had never allowed herself to think of as hers. She sat down. The trustees began speaking. Amara listened quietly. Outside, beyond the estate walls, the world remained unaware. Ryan was still living with the story he had created about her. He still believed the little cottage was proof that she had lost. Amara looked down at the final document. Then she picked up the pen. The signature was simple. Amara Bennett. Nothing about it sounded powerful. But when she finished, the room fell silent. The gate behind her was no longer a secret she was protecting. It was a door she had finally decided to open. And somewhere beyond those trees, the man who had laughed at her tiny cottage was still completely unaware of what stood behind the gate. The first time Daniel Reed saw Amara Bennett, he almost walked past her. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and the little cafe near the courthouse was nearly empty. Rain tapped softly against the windows, turning the city beyond the glass into a blur of gray reflections. Amara sat alone at a corner table. A folder rested beside her coffee. She was reading carefully, one hand supporting her chin, the other turning a page. Daniel noticed her because she was the only person in the room who seemed completely unhurried. He ordered coffee and took the table near the window. A few minutes later, the barista approached Amara. "Miss Bennett, your usual." "Thank you, Maria." Daniel glanced over. Nothing about the exchange seemed important. But then Maria smiled and added, "Your garden is beautiful now." The roses finally opened. Amara smiled back. "They did. I thought the cold had ruined them." Daniel looked down at his coffee. He didn't know why that small conversation stayed in his mind. Maybe because Amara didn't speak like someone trying to impress anyone. She simply existed in the room as though she had nothing to prove. A few minutes later, her folder slipped from the edge of the table. Several papers scattered across the floor. Daniel stood immediately. "Here." He crouched and gathered them before she could. Thank you. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. Daniel handed her the final page. You work in real estate? Amara looked at the document. Sometimes. Sometimes. A faint smile touched her lips. It's complicated. Daniel smiled. I know the feeling. That was how their conversation began. Not with money. Not with introductions designed to impress. Just coffee, rain, and two strangers talking about ordinary things. Daniel told her about a development project he had been working on. Amara listened carefully. She asked questions that surprised him. Not about how much the project was worth. Not about who was investing. She asked about the people living near the development. What happens to the families who already live there? Daniel paused. Most companies don't ask that question first. Maybe they should. There was no accusation in her voice. Only sincerity. Daniel studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected. Amara raised an eyebrow. And what did you expect? I'm not sure yet. She laughed softly. It was the first time Daniel saw her guard disappear. Over the next few weeks, they began seeing each other again. Sometimes at the cafe. Sometimes during walks through the neighborhood. Once, Daniel helped her carry several boxes of gardening supplies from her car. When he asked why she had so many, she simply said, "The cottage has more garden than I can manage alone." He looked toward the tree-lined road. Then maybe you need help. Maybe. Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked far beyond the trees. Inside, Mr. Harris waited quietly. He had known about Daniel for several weeks. He had also been instructed not to interfere. Amara wanted to know whether Daniel could see her without seeing the estate. Without seeing the family name. Without seeing the money. One evening, Daniel walked Amara to her cottage. The porch light cast a warm glow across the wooden steps. He looked at the small house and smiled. I like it. Amara looked at him. Most people don't. Most people aren't me. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she smiled. Good night, Daniel. Good night, Amara. He walked away. Amara watched until his car disappeared around the bend. Then her phone rang. Mr. Harris. Ms. Bennett, the trustees have confirmed the date. Amara looked toward the hidden trees. And the invitation? It will be sent tomorrow. She closed her eyes briefly. For the first time, the life she had tried to keep separate was moving toward the life she had built with her own hands. Soon, the gate would open. And this time, Amara would not be standing behind it alone. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning, sealed in heavy cream paper with a single black letter pressed into the front, B. Amara found it beside her coffee cup. She stared at it for several seconds before touching the envelope. The cottage was quiet. Rain had fallen during the night, leaving tiny drops of water on the kitchen window. The garden outside looked fresh and green, and somewhere near the porch, a sparrow hopped through the wet grass. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a formal invitation to an evening reception hosted by the Bennett Foundation. At the bottom was the location. Bennett Estate. Amara read the words twice. She already knew what the evening meant. For years, she had kept the estate behind closed gates, separating her family's world from the small life she had built for herself. Now those two worlds were about to meet. Her phone rang. It was Mr. Harris. Everything is confirmed, he said. Amara looked toward the window. And the guest list? Extensive. She hesitated. Is Ryan Callahan on it? There was a brief silence. Yes. Amara closed her eyes. For a moment, the past returned. Ryan standing outside the cottage. His laughter. The way he had looked at the faded porch as though it were evidence of her failure. She remembered the words he had spoken. Some people are meant for smaller lives. Her fingers tightened around the invitation. Then she slowly relaxed them. "Good," she said. Mr. Harris seemed surprised. "Good?" Amara looked down at the embossed crest. "Yes." That afternoon, she walked through the estate alone. The gardens were being prepared for the reception. Workers arranged white roses along the entrance. Tables were being set beneath the covered terrace. Soft golden lights were being hung between the trees. Nothing looked excessive. Everything looked intentional. Amara stopped beside the reflecting pool. She could hear the faint sound of water moving beneath the surface. Daniel appeared behind her. "You got the invitation." She turned. "I did." "And?" Amara smiled slightly. "I think I'm finally going to introduce you to my real life." Daniel looked toward the mansion. "I thought I already knew your real life." "You know me." She paused. "This is different." Daniel studied her expression. "Are you nervous?" "No." "Angry?" Amara shook her head. "Not anymore." That answer seemed to stay with him. Daniel stepped closer. "Then what are you feeling?" Amara looked toward the distant cottage, barely visible through the trees. "Ready." That evening, she returned to the cottage. She opened her closet. For years, she had avoided clothes that made people look twice. Tonight, she chose a simple black dress with clean lines, delicate gold earrings, and nothing else. No diamonds. No obvious symbols of wealth. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she didn't see the woman Ryan had left. She saw the woman who had survived being misunderstood. Her phone vibrated. A message from Ryan appeared. "Haven't seen you in a while. Heard you're doing well." Amara read it. Then she placed the phone face down. She didn't reply. Outside, headlights appeared beyond the trees. Mr. Harris had arrived. He waited beside the hidden gate. Amara stepped onto the porch. The evening air was cool against her skin. As she walked toward him, the iron gate slowly opened. Beyond it, the estate glowed beneath hundreds of warm lights. For a moment, Amara stood between the two worlds. The little cottage behind her. The estate ahead. Then she took one step forward. The gate opened wider. And somewhere across town, Ryan was getting ready for the same evening, still believing he was walking into a party where Amara would be a guest. He had no idea that she was the reason the gates were opening at all. The first thing Ryan noticed when he entered the estate was not the mansion. It was Amara. She stood at the top of the marble staircase beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, speaking quietly with an older man in a black suit. Her posture was relaxed. Her expression was calm. For several seconds, Ryan simply stared. Then he looked around. The room was filled with people he recognized from business magazines, charity boards, and society pages. Waiters moved silently between tables. Soft piano music drifted through the air. Crystal glasses caught the golden light above them. Ryan suddenly felt very aware of the suit he was wearing. His fiancée leaned closer. "This place is incredible." Ryan didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on Amara. She wasn't standing near the entrance. She wasn't waiting to be introduced. People were coming to her. A foundation director approached and shook her hand. A senior executive smiled and spoke to her with obvious respect. An elderly woman embraced her warmly before moving away. Ryan's expression slowly changed. "Do you know who she is?" his fiancée whispered. Ryan swallowed. "She's my ex-wife." His fiancée looked at him. "The woman with the cottage?" Ryan nodded. For the first time that evening, he didn't laugh. Across the room, Amara turned. Their eyes met. The noise around them seemed to soften. Ryan expected something. Anger. Triumph. Maybe even satisfaction. There was none. Amara simply looked at him for a moment, then gave a small, polite smile. "Ryan." He walked toward her. "Amara." His voice sounded different now. Careful. Uncertain. He glanced around again. "I didn't know you were involved with this." Amara held his gaze. "There are many things you didn't know." The sentence was quiet. It landed harder than an accusation. Ryan forced a smile. "Well, you certainly kept this place a secret." "I kept my life private." He looked toward the tall windows. "So this is why you moved into that little cottage?" Amara's expression barely changed. "No." Ryan frowned. "No. I moved into the cottage because I wanted to." For a moment, he didn't understand. Then a server approached Amara. "Ms. Bennett, the board members are ready for you." Ryan turned sharply. "Ms. Bennett?" The server nodded respectfully. "Of course." Amara gave the man a quiet smile. "I'll be there shortly." Ryan watched him leave. His eyes moved toward the staircase. Then toward the portraits on the walls. Then back to Amara. "Bennett," he whispered. She said nothing. Suddenly, memories began rearranging themselves inside his mind. The way Amara had always avoided talking about her family. The old documents he had once seen in her desk. The phone calls she never discussed. The trip she had refused to take with him because, as she had said, she had something important to handle. He had never asked. He had simply assumed. Amara watched the realization slowly reach his face. She didn't help him. She didn't need to. A few feet away, Daniel stood near the terrace doors. He saw Ryan. He saw Amara. And he understood immediately. Ryan glanced toward him. "Who is that?" Amara looked over. "Daniel." Daniel approached with an easy smile. "Good evening." Ryan shook his hand. "Ryan Callahan." "I know." The words were polite. But something about them made Ryan pause. Daniel released his hand and turned toward Amara. "Are you ready?" Amara nodded. "Yes." She walked beside him toward the center of the room. Ryan remained where he was. For years, he had believed Amara had lost everything when she left him. Now he was standing inside a world she had never needed him to enter. And the strangest part was that she wasn't looking back to see whether he understood. She already knew the truth. She had simply stopped needing him to know it. Ryan had spent the entire evening trying to find a version of Amara that made sense. The woman standing beside Daniel looked nothing like the woman he had laughed at outside the cottage. Yet somehow, she was the same person. The difference was not the dress. It was the way everyone in the room seemed to know exactly who she was. Ryan watched as Amara stepped onto the small platform near the center of the ballroom. The music faded. Conversation softened. Dozens of faces turned toward her. A foundation director handed her a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Amara Bennett, chair of the Bennett Foundation." Ryan's breath caught. Chair. The word echoed strangely in his mind. He looked at his fiancée. She was staring at him now. You said she wasn't doing well. Ryan didn't answer. Amara began speaking. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. She talked about the foundation's work, about restoring community gardens, supporting young entrepreneurs, and funding housing projects for families who had spent years being overlooked. Nothing about the speech sounded like a performance. There was no arrogance. No attempt to impress the room. She spoke as though she were discussing something deeply personal. Ryan felt something uncomfortable settle in his chest. He remembered the woman who had once sat beside him at their tiny apartment table, carefully calculating their grocery budget. He remembered how she had donated part of her own savings to help a neighbor pay medical bills. He had called it sentimental. Now he was standing inside a foundation built around the same values. The realization made his stomach tighten. When Amara finished, the room applauded. Ryan did not. He couldn't. Instead, he looked toward the far wall. A series of framed photographs displayed the history of the Bennett Foundation. Then he saw it. A photograph of Amara's father standing beside the estate decades earlier. Beneath it was a brass plaque. Bennett Family Trust, established 1984. Ryan stared. His mind returned to the cottage. The small porch. The old mailbox. The sentence he had spoken. So this is what you ended up with? Suddenly, the memory felt crueler than it had that morning. Amara stepped down from the platform. Daniel approached her. He said something that made her smile. Ryan watched them. There was no jealousy in Daniel's expression. No calculation. He looked at Amara with quiet respect. Ryan realized that was what had always been missing between himself and her. He had looked at what she possessed. Daniel looked at who she was. Ryan finally found the courage to approach. Amara. She turned. Yes. He glanced around the room. So all of this belongs to you? Amara was silent for a moment. Then she answered simply. My family built it. I'm responsible for it now. Ryan shook his head slowly. The cottage. Yes. You chose to live there. Yes. He looked genuinely confused. Why? Amara's eyes softened. Because it feels like home. Ryan lowered his voice. I thought you had lost everything. She looked at him for several seconds. I know. There was no anger in her answer. That somehow hurt more. Ryan wanted to say something meaningful. An apology. An explanation. Anything that could repair the distance between the person he had married and the person standing before him. But every sentence sounded too small. Then an older trustee approached. Ms. Bennett, the board is ready for your signature. Ryan looked at the document folder. The crest on its cover was the same one he had seen on the invitation. The trustee turned to Daniel. Mr. Reed, the final partnership papers are ready as well. Daniel nodded. Ryan looked between them. Partnership? Daniel met his eyes. Yes. Amara and I are working together on the new housing initiative. Ryan suddenly understood. The cottage had never been the evidence of her failure. It had been the first visible sign of a life she had chosen deliberately. He looked back toward Amara. She was already turning away. Not because she wanted to punish him. Because the evening had moved on. And for the first time, Ryan understood something far more painful than discovering how wealthy she was. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness. He had mistaken simplicity for failure. And he had laughed at the one thing she had never needed to prove. Her worth. By the time the last guests began leaving the estate, the night had become almost completely quiet. The music had stopped. The chandeliers still cast a warm golden glow across the ballroom, but the laughter and conversation had faded into distant echoes. Amara stood near the tall glass doors overlooking the garden. Outside, the path toward the cottage disappeared beneath the trees. For a moment, she simply watched the lights reflected across the dark surface of the reflecting pool. Daniel approached slowly. "You okay?" Amara nodded. "I am." He looked toward the ballroom. "Ryan?" She followed his gaze. Ryan stood near the entrance, alone. His fiancée had already left. The confident expression he had worn when he arrived was gone. He looked smaller somehow. Not because the room had changed. Because he had. Daniel lowered his voice. "You don't have to speak to him." "I know." Amara remained silent for another moment. Then she walked toward Ryan. He noticed her approaching and straightened instinctively. "Amara." She stopped a few feet away. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Ryan looked at her carefully. "I owe you an apology." Amara said nothing. "I was wrong about you." Her eyes remained calm. Ryan swallowed. "I thought the cottage meant you had lost everything." A faint sadness crossed her face. "You thought I had lost myself." He looked down. "I suppose I did." The words came out quietly. There was no audience now. No guests watching. No room full of people waiting for a dramatic confrontation. Only two people standing beneath the fading lights of a party that had finally ended. Ryan took a breath. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Amara looked toward the garden. "Because I wanted to know if you loved me without knowing what I had." Ryan closed his eyes for a second. That sentence hurt more than anger would have. "And?" Amara looked back at him. "I got my answer." He nodded slowly. There was nothing he could say to change the past. So he didn't try. "I really did love you," he whispered. Amara's expression softened, but she did not step closer. "I believe you." Ryan looked surprised. She continued. "But loving someone and knowing how to value them aren't always the same thing." He lowered his eyes. For the first time since their divorce, he seemed to understand that the woman standing before him wasn't waiting for an apology to give her permission to move forward. She had already moved forward. Ryan glanced toward the windows. "Do you still live in the cottage?" "Yes." "Even now?" Amara smiled. "Especially now." He looked confused. "Why?" She turned toward the garden. "Because it's where I learned that a small life can still be a full one." Ryan said nothing. Daniel waited near the terrace, giving them space. Amara looked at him for a moment before turning back toward Ryan. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Ryan nodded. "I think I finally understand what I was looking for." She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't need to. Amara walked away. The ballroom doors opened softly as she stepped outside. Cool night air touched her face. She followed the familiar path through the garden, past the roses, beneath the trees, toward the little cottage that had once been the subject of Ryan's laughter. Behind her, the estate remained illuminated. Ahead of her, one small porch light waited. Amara climbed the wooden steps. She unlocked the door. Inside, everything was exactly as she had left it. The kettle. The books. The simple wooden table. The small vase of rosemary beside the window. Nothing had changed. And somehow, everything had. She placed her keys on the table and looked through the glass toward the estate behind the trees. For years, she had thought freedom meant proving Ryan wrong. Tonight, she finally understood. It didn't. Freedom meant no longer caring whether he understood her at all. Amara turned off the kitchen light. The cottage fell quiet. Behind the gate, the estate continued to glow beneath the night sky. But she didn't look back. She closed the curtains, made herself a cup of tea, and sat beside the window. No applause. No cameras. No revenge. Just peace. And somewhere in the darkness behind her, the gate slowly closed. Not to hide her life anymore, but to protect the life she had finally learned to call her own. She had never needed to make Ryan regret losing her. She had only needed to stop regretting herself. And that was the victory no one could take away.